What's up everybody, it's Rafi at Zurb and I got a great video for you today. You're going to learn the foundation grid. So this is probably the most used component in foundation because at some point you're going to need some way to align your content and get it working responsively as well. So that way your content can shift and adjust depending on the screen size to fit any device. So the foundation grid will help you do that. Let's take a look at a quick example so you can see what I'm talking about. We have a sidebar on the left, we have the rest of the content over here on the right, and then we also have this like 4-up grid of content. So all this is done with the foundation grid. See here you have a section on the left and a section on the right, and they're both equal width. This is all done with the foundation grid. I'm going to show you how the foundation grid works. I'm going to explain what it takes to set that up. So let's jump into that. So let's hop over to this example and we'll explain how the grid works. So we have a container called a row. And so over here, as you can see, we have our row that houses the class of columns. So let me explain what all this is. So if we take a look at our example over here on the right, we have this container that has 12 distinct pieces inside of it. So this is actually a row. So this container that holds all these 12 pieces, we're going to call them columns because that's what they are, is actually called a row. And it's denoted by the row class. So we have div with the class of row, and that is our wrapper. That's our container that holds our columns. Now, foundation is based on a 12-column grid system, so that means that you can carve up the width of this row by up to 12 columns. Now, you can actually change that to be more or less, just depending on your needs, and that's easily done in the SAS version of Foundation or with some changes to the CSS. But by default, it's a 12-column grid. And the reason it's a 12-column grid is it's really easy to carve this up into 2, 4, 6, and of course 12 columns. So what I mean by that is, let me show you. So instead of having this be 12 equal columns, we're going to get rid of a bunch of them. In fact, we're going to get rid of all but one. Okay, so now we have a row with just one single column inside of it. And you can see that that column is just taking up the width of one column. What that means is it's dividing this row by 1 out of 12. So let's say we wanted to make this column a little bit bigger because we have more content to store inside of it. So let's say we want this to be the width of 3 columns. So now this column has a class of small-3, and I'll explain what the sizing here, small, means in just a moment. But right now you can see that it spans the width of what 3 columns take up. So that's actually 25% of the width of the row because 12 divided by 3 is 25%. So if I wanted to make this take up 50% of the width of the row, I'm going to make this small-6. So now you can see that this one column takes up 50% of the width of the row. Now if I put another column right next to it that's also 6 columns, you could see that together they both now take up the entire width of the row, each of them 50%. Now we can mix and match these sizes any way we want. So let's say I want this first column to be 3 columns because it's going to contain a sidebar. And then I want the second columns to take up the remaining 9 columns. So when I do that, now they add up to 12 total columns. So you can see that we have available 12 columns of width inside of our row. And the first column is taking up the width of 3. The second column here is taking up the width of 9. Now we could just reverse these if we want. If we want the larger content to be on the left and the smaller content to be on the right. Now we can add more columns in here, up to 12, but you're going to have probably the best results if you make sure that the columns add up to, again, 12. So if I'm going to put a third column in here, now I have 3, 3, and 6. Now these all add up to 12 together, and now I have a 3-column section on the left, a 6-column section in the middle, and then a 3-column section on the right. So again, a row is a container for your columns, and it can house up to 12 total columns. So if we just add these columns up together, you can see that that is what it creates. You can also do incomplete rows. So I don't need to add up to 12. I can have less than 12. So again, like the first example here, we have 3 columns wide, or you can make this 6. Let's say I just wanted a row with an image that was over to the left. This would be an easy way to set that up. And then this could be any kind of arbitrary content. So I have this blue box that shows what my content looks like, but it could really just be anything. So I'm gonna add some lorem ipsum in there, and you can see that now the column gets taller and fits that content inside. So I wanna explain 2 concepts here. So first of all, it is a column because it can get as tall as it needs to house the content inside of it. So it is a vertical column that splits up your row horizontally. So again, the columns don't have any specific height to them. They'll just take the height of the content inside of them. So if I go over here now and make another 6 columns on the other side, but this one is shorter, you can see that they're going to be auto height, so height of the content inside of them. Okay? And the other important concept here is this spacing that you see here on the left and the right of the column. So the column is, again, wrapped in this black border, as you can see here. So spacing on the left and the right is called a gutter. And what it is made out of is padding. So this is padding inside of the column. So again, we're using box model to set this up. So foundation is all built on box model. And so what that means is you have your box here, which is the column, and then the padding is inside of that column. So the padding on the left and the right is this lighter blue. And what this does is it keeps your content from hitting the edges of the column. Now I'm going to collapse this just to show you the difference. So if it didn't have any padding here, and I could make this a little bit taller. So you can see that if there was no padding between the columns, that your content is now butting up against the next column over. And so now you have content that's touching each other, and that doesn't look very nice. So the padding on the columns, which is the gutter, is actually what keeps that spacing nice, so that way you don't have your content touching each other. So that's the basics of the grid. We're talking about sizing, and we're talking about gutters. Now we're going to start getting into the responsive classes. So I'm going to reset this back to the way it was. So let's do that. Okay. So I have 2 6-column containers. So the word small in front of this, so small-6, means that on a small screen, I'm going to be 6 columns wide, or this column is going to be 6 columns wide. And of course, on this one, same thing. On a small screen, it's going to be 6 columns wide. Now, what that means is that this is a mobile-first framework, so all the CSS is written for small screens, and it applies to larger screens unless you override that. So, because it's a responsive framework, we're right now defining that on a small screen and every size larger, it's going to be, these two columns are going to be 6 columns wide, which means they're going to be 50%. So now as I adjust the screen smaller, you can see that it remains 50% width. If I make the screen way bigger, it's still 50% width. So this would represent like a laptop or desktop screen, and then maybe on an iPad or some kind of tablet, and then on mobile devices, still staying 50% each width side by side. So now we can change that to be responsive. So instead of small dash 6, we're going to change these to small dash 12 and small dash 12. So now what this means is that each of these columns is going to take up 12 columns of space. That means it's going to take up the full width of the row. So this one here is first, and I'll just write first in here. And this one here is second because it's second in code. So that means it'll drop down to the next line. Okay? So that's pretty simple to understand. So on a small screen, if I want these columns to stack, I'll make them small 12 full width. Now, interestingly, you don't actually need these sizing classes because if you don't add them, it'll default to full width 12 columns. So if I got rid of that, you can see that the behavior wouldn't change. So that's just a small note. If you want to type a little bit less, you're making a full width column, just do it like that. So now I want to override this on a medium screen. So let's adjust over here to, let's say, a medium screen. And now I want this to be on medium. I want this to be 6 columns. And then on medium, I want this one to also be 6 columns. Okay, so there we are. We're on a medium screen, and now you see the behavior is overridden to be 6 columns, so 50% width for both of these columns. And again, we drop down to a small screen, and it's going to revert back to small 12, which means full width, and let's make these things stack. So now we want to do this on a large screen. We want to change it even further. So let's go back to our column class definition. We're going to chain another class in here. Now we're going to do large. So we're going to do large dash 3 and large dash 9. So 3 plus 9 equals 12. So when we change this to a large screen, you'll see that definition change. So now we are on a large screen, and now you can see that the column on the left, which is the first column in our code, is a large 3. So you can see that on a large screen, it's going to span 3 columns wide out of the total 12. And then the next column next to it is going to be large dash 9. And so this is taking up 9 columns of space. Now, another note on incomplete columns is that we can make these behave differently. So we don't have to always add up to 12. So right now, the first column is 3. Let's say we want the last column to also be 3. We can totally do that. So by default, using the float-based standard grid in Foundation, this is going to float over to the left. To the right. So the second column is 3, the first column is 3, so that only adds up to 6. So we have this empty gap in the middle of 6 columns. So the default behavior is that your last column that does not fill up the remaining space will actually float over to the right. So this is usually desired behavior if you want to have your items split apart on the screen, which is nice. Otherwise, you can override that and make them both float over to the left by adding the end class to this second column. So the end class will override that default behavior and now float them both over to the left. Okay, so I switched views here because I want to show you a different aspect of the grid as well. So you notice that we have a row here that spans a certain width of the page, but then it doesn't span the full width of the page. Well, a row also has a maximum width. So it's set to max width 1200 pixels by default. Now this is something you can change in your CSS, or you can even change it in the settings file if you're using the SAS version really easily. But by default it's 1200 pixels and it's centered inside the page. That means if you get on a super wide screen that your grid columns are not going to expand all the way across that entire giant screen, which would make your content kind of stretch out. So it is contained 1200 pixels max width and it's centered inside the page, as you can see here. Now if you did want to override that, and you might want to override that for certain sections, you can add the expanded class onto this row. So by doing that, you can see now the row is fluid width or full width of the screen. So that's optional on any particular row. You can add that expanded class. Now, some other interesting things that you could do with the grid is you can actually push your content around if you need to. So there are offset classes in Foundation's grid that allow you to push your columns over. So for example, we have this example here that has two columns that are large -3. So there are 3 columns wide on a large screen. Let's say I want to push these columns over, maybe by 3 columns. So we could actually do this. So on a large screen, we'll do large -offset -3, let's say. So what this is going to do is it's actually going to push from the left these columns over by 3 columns. So you can see the width of 3 columns is here. It's kind of an empty space, but that means it's being offset over by 3 columns. And actually, in this case, it centers these 2 columns. So that is one way that you can center these 2 columns. Now, this is again a responsive type of class, so this is only going to affect it on a large screen. Now we can actually change this to a medium screen. So we could do medium -offset -2. Okay, and I spelled that wrong, so let's fix that. So there you go, medium -offset 2. And then I could do small -offset, let's say 1. So now I'm changing the offsets based on screen sizes. Maybe you wouldn't do this in real life, but you have the options and that control. Okay, so now I'm going to scale down to a smaller screen and show you how those respond. I'm gonna get rid of this second column just so you can see the basic example here. So our first column, this is offset over by 3, so you can see it's pushed over by 3 columns on a large screen. Then on medium, we wanted the offset to only be 2, so now you can see it's only pushed over by 2 columns. And then on a small screen, we want it only pushed over by 1 column, so you can see that is now pushed over by 1 column. So that is how the offsets work. So you could push your columns over just depending on how you need that done. Now, you could also do this on the second column. So let's say, let's get rid of this. We'll just use the large example for now. So we're going to take the offset off of the first column and we're going to add it onto the second column. So you can see here I pushed over the second column by 3. So now you can individually push the column over. This way you can get that alignment that you need on either a large, medium, or small screen. Okay, so another interesting thing you can do with the Foundation grid is source ordering. So what that means is you can actually control the order of the content depending on the screen size. So in this example over here on the right, I have an image on the far right of this row, and then I have some text on the left. Now, typically you might see content sections like this where the image is on the left and the text is on the right. And when those stack to a small screen, the image is on top and the text is on bottom. So in this case, it's a little reversed. When we go down to a small screen, you can see that now the image is below and the text is above. Now we actually want that to be the opposite. So let's go ahead and take a look at our code and set it up that way. So what do we have here? We have something that is 10 columns wide on medium and large screens. So that's this first section here with the text is 10 columns wide on medium and large screens. And what that means is because it's first in the code as well, because the next set of columns that holds the image is down here, it's second in code. Of course, the image is going to be below on a mobile screen when this stacks because it's set to small 12, so then it's going to be full width. So what we want to do is reverse that because you actually want this to be set up the way you want it on mobile. So again, this is a mobile first framework. So we have to think about our code as it would look like on a mobile device. So if I did that, I just swapped the order of the image and the text as you can see here. So we have our 2-column section that holds the image. Now it's first in code, so that means it's on top for small. But when we get to a medium and larger screen, now they're not in the correct order. We actually want the text on the left and the image on the right. So that's where we use Foundation source ordering classes. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. So I'm going to say on a medium screen and larger, so I'm going to type in medium dash. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this, or I'm going to push this image over to the right by 10 columns. And the reason I'm going to push it over by 10 columns is because that is the width of the next section that has the text. So I want to actually push it that same amount. So I'm going to push it over. So again, I'm going to do medium dash push dash 10. So I'm going to push it over 10 columns. So right now you see that it's pushed over 10 columns. It is in the right spot, but this next set of columns is underneath it and it's overlapping. So now you might guess what the next class is. We're going to go on to the next set of columns and we're going to say medium. So for a medium screen and larger, we're going to pull. And we're going to pull it over 2 columns because that's the width of the image. So there you go. We just did source ordering. So now I pulled one column over by 2 and I pushed the other column over by 10. Now when we drop down to a small screen, you can see that they stack in the correct order. So that is Foundation Grid source ordering. So a couple last things that we want to cover in this grid lesson is the centering in Foundation's grid. So you can center one set of columns. So now I'm going to remove all this extra content and I'm just going to leave this image in here because that's a nice thing to center. Okay, so I have my row and I have what is right now a large 2 container and a medium 2. So on both medium and large, it's only going to span 2 of the available 12 columns. And I actually have this floated over to the left right now because that's the default behavior. But what if I want to center this? So I can actually center this with a class on the column. So I can add medium dash centered. So that means for a medium screen and larger, so medium and large, it's going to be centered. So as you can see here, when we get down to a small screen, it's not going to be centered, but as we're on a medium screen and as we're on any larger screen, you can see that the columns stay centered. Now, of course, you can also do the same thing here. So we can make this 2 and we can make this small dash centered. So small dash centered means that it's going to be centered on a small screen, it's going to be centered on a medium screen, and it's going to be centered on a large screen and extra large and extra large also. So as you can see here, it's going to constantly say centered, and it's going to be in a 2-column container. Now, if I want it to be a little bit wider on a small screen, I could do that. So I can make it 4 columns wide and then still see that it is continuously centered. All right, and again, this blue section just depicts the width of the row there. Okay, so on top of that, you can also override this behavior. So let's say I said it's going to be small centered, but then on a large screen, let's say I want it to not be centered. So I can actually override that with the large uncentered class. So now when we get to a large screen, you can see that the column is now uncentered. On a medium screen, it's still centered because we didn't override that here. It's small centered, and so it's also going to be medium centered. Until we hit the large breakpoint, then it's going to be uncentered. So that's how you can use Foundation's centering classes. Now again, you can only center 1 column at a time in the float grid of Foundation. So if you're trying to center multiple columns together, then you'll want to nest the grid. And so that actually brings me to grid nesting. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Alrighty, so now I'm going to show you how to nest the grid in Foundation. So let's just take a look at our outer wrapper. So right now we have a row with a single column. So you can see the columns class here, and it's small dash 12 and medium dash 8. Okay, so what that means is on a medium screen, it's only going to be 8 columns wide, and I have centered it. So right now you can see that border, but there's no height here because there's no content inside of it. So we're actually going to now nest a grid inside of this 8-column container. So I'm inside of the 8 columns, and I'm going to nest the grid. Now when you nest, you need to use the same row column pattern. That means row, column, row, column. What you don't want to do is put columns directly inside of columns or rows directly inside of rows. So it needs to follow this pattern, that way the padding is correct, or that gutter is lined up correctly. So now I'm going to add some columns. So I'm going to add 2 columns inside of this nested row, and I'm going to give them classes of small dash 6 and small dash 6. Okay, so when you nest columns inside of a row, you still have 12 available columns to use. So let me show you what I mean. So now I have nested columns inside of columns. So let me just explain what we're talking about here. So the outer column is 8 columns wide, so it's medium dash 8. So on a medium and larger screen right now, it's going to be 8 columns wide, which is this outer box here. And it also has a class of medium centered, so that means it's going to be centered, and that's why it is in the middle right now. And then inside of that column, we have another row with 2 small dash 6 columns. So that means these columns are going to take up 50% of the width on a small screen, on a medium screen, and on a larger screen. So that's how you can nest columns inside of another row in columns. So this is called grid nesting, and what it does is it gives you some finer control of your layout. So now I have 50% width split apart inside of this 8-column container. And you could really nest infinitely, although, at some point it would get really ridiculous. But let's just say we wanted to nest inside of this other set of columns. You can see Now I have nested another set of columns inside of this column. So you could definitely go as deep as you need to get that fine control of your layout, although probably more than 3 levels deep, and maybe you should relook at how you're setting up that layout. And last but not least is the foundation block grid. So the block grid is part of the grid as of Foundation 6 instead of its own separate component. And what this does is it allows you to create an arbitrary number of columns inside of your row. Now here I'm going to use the column class. Now notice that there's no S on the end. It doesn't really matter. Foundation's grid works with column or columns. It's just singular versus plural. It's just semantics. So you can use them interchangeably. So I'm going to set up this row with a single column here, and I'm going to put an image inside. So I'm going to put my favorite placeholder image, placehold.it, and let's make it 200 pixels wide. Okay, great. So here I have a row with a single column. Now what if I wanted to put an arbitrary number of columns inside this row? Well, I can do that using the foundation block grid syntax. So it's still part of the grid, but now there's a different way to write the grid classes that will allow you to, infinitely nest columns inside. Now the columns are all going to be equal width. So let's take a look at what that means. So here we're going to add some parent level sizing. So we're going to do small dash up dash 2. So what this means is that on a small screen, we're going to allow 2 columns to be side by side only. And then on a medium screen, we're going to say medium dash up dash 4. And then on a large screen, we're going to say large dash up dash 6. Okay, so let me show you what this means. I'm going to have to add more columns. So I'm just going to paste in more columns here. And again, I can nest as many columns as I want because the block grid automatically takes care of any of this wrapping. So let me show you what I mean. No longer are we constrained to a 12 column row. So what this means is I can define on every screen size how many blocks can be side by side next to each other before they wrap to the next line. So right now, if I go up to a large screen, you could see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's going to be 6 columns side by side. And that's because the class that we're using is large up 6. And we put that on the same div as the row. And what that does is it allows this to allow 6 blocks before wrapping to the next row. So if this is a float-based grid that you're using, then it's automatically clearing the floats. If you're using the flex-based grid, then it is using the row wrap function of Flexbox. So then on a medium screen, now we have 4 blocks side by side, and that's because we define this to be medium up 4. Now if I change this over to medium up 3, then you can see it adjust, and now there's only 3 blocks side by side on each row. So, 4 works better for my content or my image sizing. You can see that the images fill up the grid nicely. And then on a small screen, we want this to be small up 2, and you can see that there's 2 columns side by side. Now if we want these images to fill out the width of the columns completely, we could definitely make them a little bit bigger, like 450 pixels. And you can see that that fills the entire width of the columns. So that is the foundation block grid. There is another modifier class that you can add to the columns. So I'm going to select all these columns, and then I'm going to add the column Gotta spell that right, column block class. And what this is going to do is now give it equal spacing on the bottom that it has left and right. So that gutter in between the columns, that padding, is now duplicated below with margin bottom. So now you can see that that creates a nice image gallery type of layout here for your blocks. So this is the foundation block grid. And of course, if you ever did want to get rid of all that gap in between the columns, you definitely could. We can just go back up to the row and add the collapse class. And you got to spell that right, collapse, and now that removes all the gap in between the images, so now you have like an image gallery where all the images are touching. So that concludes the foundation grid. Lots of stuff there. If you want to deep dive into the foundation grid, learn some tips and tricks, along with all the other components in foundation, make sure you check out the Intro to Foundation class here. I'll link it at the end. Thanks, everybody.